The wind cut through the bare branches of Lakeview Cemetery in Chicago, carrying a bite of winter that stung James Harrington's face as he stepped out of his Bentley. At 45, he was the kind of man who turned heads. Sharp jawline, salt and pepper hair, and a tailored suit that screamed money. He'd built a financial empire from the ground up, a titan in the world of investments, but today none of that mattered. Today was about Olivia. 3 years ago, she'd been taken from him in a car accident. A sudden, brutal loss that left a hole he'd never quite filled. Every year on this day, he came here with a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite, to stand by her grave and let the silence swallow him whole. The gravel crunched under his polished shoes as he made his way through the rows of headstones, the faint hum of the city fading into the background. He adjusted his scarf, the cold seeping through his gloves, and let his mind drift to her. Olivia's laugh, her quiet strength, the way she'd made his penthouse feel like a home instead of just a status symbol. He'd loved her more than he'd ever admitted, even to himself, and then, just like that, she was gone. He rounded a corner, the familiar gray marble of her headstone coming into view, and stopped dead in his tracks. There was someone there. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on the frosty ground right beside Olivia's grave. She was bundled in a thin coat that looked 2 sizes too big, her dark brown hair spilling out from under a knit cap. Her hands clutched her knees, and her head was bowed like she was praying, or maybe just trying to keep warm. James frowned. Kids didn't belong in cemeteries alone, especially not in this weather. "Hey," he called out, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "You lost, kid?" The girl's head snapped up, and when her eyes met his, James felt the air leave his lungs. They were big, deep brown eyes, exactly like Olivia's, not just in color, but in the way they seemed to hold a quiet, unshakable sadness. For a second, he thought he was imagining it, some trick of grief playing with his head. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, her pale cheeks streaked with dried tears. "No," she finally said, her voice small but steady. "I'm not lost. I came to see my mom." James blinked, the words not quite sinking in. "Your mom?" He took a step closer, glancing at the headstone to make sure he hadn't wandered to the wrong spot. The name stared back at him, carved in cold stone. Olivia Harrington. His Olivia. He looked back at the girl, his brows knitting together. "What do you mean, your mom?" She tilted her head slightly, like she was confused by his confusion, then pointed a small gloved finger at the grave. "Her. Olivia. She's my mom." The world tilted under James's feet. His grip tightened on the lilies until the stems bent in his hand. This had to be a mistake, a sick joke maybe, or some mix-up. He and Olivia had never had kids. They'd talked about it, sure, late at night over glasses of wine, dreaming of a little family to balance out their chaotic lives. But it never happened. Work got in the way, then the accident did, and that was that. So who was this girl, and why did she have Olivia's eyes? "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost afraid of what she'd say next. "Sophie," she answered, wiping her nose with the back of her sleeve. "Sophie Miller." The name didn't ring any bells, but those eyes, they wouldn't let him go. He knelt down, bringing himself to her level, the cold seeping through his trousers. "Sophie, why do you think Olivia's your mom?" She looked at him like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because she told me she was." James's heart thudded hard against his ribs. He didn't know what to say, what to think. All he knew was that this little girl, sitting by his wife's grave, had just cracked open a part of his life he'd thought was long buried. James stayed crouched there in the frost-bitten grass, his knees aching from the cold, but he barely noticed. Sophie's words echoed in his head like a song he couldn't unhear. "Because she told me she was." His breath came out in short, misty clouds as he stared at this girl, this stranger, who'd just turned his world upside down with a handful of quiet syllables. The lilies lay forgotten beside him, their petals brushing the ground, and all he could do was look into those eyes, Olivia's eyes. It was uncanny, unsettling, like staring at a ghost wrapped in a too big coat. "Sophie," he said, his voice low, trying to keep it steady. "What do you mean she told you? When? How?" Sophie shifted a little, pulling her knees tighter against her chest. She didn't look scared, just tired, like she'd carried something heavy for too long. She used to come see me, she said, her words soft but clear. At the home, where I live. She'd bring me stuff, books, candy, sometimes a sweater. She'd sit with me and talk, tell me stories. She said she was my mom, but I couldn't tell anybody. James's stomach twisted. The home? He asked, his mind scrambling to piece it together. What home? It's a place out by the edge of the city, she said. A house for kids like me, ones who don't have anybody. Mrs. Margaret runs it. A house for kids with no one, an orphanage, or something like it. James's head spun. He tried to picture Olivia. His Olivia, with her warm smile and her knack for making everything feel right, slipping out to some rundown charity house to visit a little girl. It didn't fit. She'd been his partner, his confidant. They'd shared everything, or so he'd thought. Late nights at the office, quiet dinners at home, vacations to places most people only dreamed of. When would she have had time for this? And why wouldn't she have told him? How often did she come? He asked, his throat tight. Sophie shrugged, her small shoulders barely lifting the oversized coat. Maybe once a month, sometimes more. She'd stay for a little while, then leave. She always looked kind of sad when she said goodbye. Then, a few years ago, she just stopped. I didn't know why until Mrs. Margaret told me she died. 3 years ago. The timeline clicked into place like a lock snapping shut. Olivia's accident had been sudden. A rainy night, a slick road, a truck that didn't stop in time. James had spent months afterward drowning in grief, replaying every moment he could have done differently. But this wasn't part of those memories. He'd never seen a hint of it, not a single clue that his wife had been living a double life. He ran a hand through his hair, the cold biting at his fingers. Sophie, listen to me. Olivia and I, we were married for 10 years. We didn't have kids. We wanted them, but it never happened. So I don't understand how she could be your mom. Sophie's brow furrowed like she was trying to solve a puzzle herself. I don't know, she said simply. She just was. She said she had to keep me safe, so I stayed at the home. She told me she loved me even if she couldn't take me with her. Safe. That word stuck in James's chest like a splinter. Safe from what? From who? He studied Sophie's face, searching for answers in the curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell across her forehead. She didn't just have Olivia's eyes. She had her quiet stubbornness, too. That same spark he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. It was impossible, but it was there, staring back at him. How'd you get here today? He asked, trying to anchor himself in something practical. I took the bus, she said. Mrs. Margaret doesn't like me coming out here alone, but I saved up my allowance. I wanted to see her today. It's been 3 years. 3 years. The same day he came every year. James didn't know if that was a coincidence or something more, but it sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He stood up slowly, his knees creaking, and looked down at her. She was so small, so fragile, sitting there by Olivia's grave like it was the only place she belonged. He couldn't just leave her here. Not with those eyes, not with that story rattling around in his head. Come on, he said, holding out a hand. It's too cold out here. Let me take you back to that home of yours. I need to talk to this Mrs. Margaret. Sophie hesitated, her gaze flicking between his hand and his face, like she wasn't sure she could trust him. Fair enough. He wasn't sure he trusted himself right now either. But after a moment, she nodded and took his hand, her fingers small and icy in his grip. He led her back to the Bentley, opening the passenger door for her. She climbed in without a word, buckling herself in like she'd done it 100 times before. As he started the engine, the heat blasting through the vents, James glanced over at her. She sat there quietly, staring out the window at the gray blur of the cemetery fading behind them. His mind was a mess, questions piling up faster than he could sort them out. Olivia had a daughter, or claimed to? Why keep it a secret? And what the hell was he supposed to do about it now? He gripped the steering wheel tighter, the leather creaking under his hands. Sophie, he said after a long silence, did Olivia ever say anything about me? She turned her head, those big brown eyes locking onto his. Yeah, she said softly. She said you were a good man, that you'd understand someday. Understand what? James wanted to ask, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he just nodded and kept driving, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. He didn't know what he was walking into, but one thing was clear. Whatever Sophie had just dragged out of the shadows, it was about to change everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd loved. The drive to the edge of Chicago felt longer than it should have, the city's skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror as James navigated the Bentley through quieter, grittier streets. Sophie sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window like she was counting the cracks in the pavement. Every now and then, he stole a glance at her. Those brown eyes, that soft curve of her face, and his chest tightened. She looked so much like Olivia, it hurt to breathe. But how? That question gnawed at him, sharper with every mile. He didn't say much, and neither did she. The silence wasn't awkward, just heavy, like they were both carrying something too big to put into words. When they finally pulled up to the house, a weathered two-story building tucked between a pawn shop and an empty lot, James cut the engine and sat there for a second, staring at the chipped paint and the crooked sign that read Hope House. This was where Olivia had come? This was where she'd hidden a piece of her life from him? Sophie unbuckled her seatbelt and climbed out, her boots scuffing the sidewalk as she waited for him. He followed, locking the car with a beat that felt too loud in the stillness. The air smelled faintly of diesel and damp leaves, and as they walked up the cracked steps, James felt like he was stepping into someone else's story, one he wasn't sure he wanted to read. The door creaked open before they could knock, and a woman stood there, older, maybe in her 60s, with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and a face lined with years of hard-earned kindness. "Sophie," she said, her voice warm but edged with worry. "Where have you been? I told you not to—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes landing on James. They widened slightly, taking in his suit, his stance, the way he loomed in her doorway, like he didn't quite belong. "And who's this?" "This is James," Sophie said, her tone matter-of-fact. "He was at Mom's grave, too." The woman, Mrs. Margaret, James assumed, froze, her hand still gripping the doorknob. For a moment, she just looked at him, like she was sizing him up, piecing something together. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said, her voice quieter now. "Both of you." Inside, the house smelled like old wood and cinnamon, a faint warmth cutting through the chill. The living room was cluttered but cozy. Mismatched furniture, a threadbare rug, a few kids' drawings taped to the walls. Sophie slipped off her coat and hung it on a hook like it was second nature, then perched on the edge of a sagging couch. James stayed standing, his hands shoved in his pockets, feeling too big for the space. "You're James Harrington," Mrs. Margaret said, closing the door behind her. It wasn't a question. "Olivia's husband." He nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, and I'm guessing you know more about my wife than I do right now." She sighed, a sound that carried years of weight, and gestured for him to sit. He didn't. "Sophie," she said gently, "why don't you go upstairs for a bit? I need to talk to Mr. Harrington." Sophie hesitated, her eyes flicking to James like she wasn't sure she should leave him alone, but she nodded and padded up the stairs, her footsteps fading into the creak of the floorboards. When she was gone, Mrs. Margaret turned back to him, folding her arms across her chest. "I knew this day might come," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Olivia warned me it could." "Warned you?" James's patience was fraying. "What the hell's going on? That kid says Olivia's her mother. We never had a daughter. So either she's lying, or you are, or—" He stopped, running a hand over his face. "Just tell me the truth." Mrs. Margaret didn't flinch. She walked over to a small desk in the corner, pulled open a drawer, and took out a faded envelope. "Olivia brought Sophie here when she was just a baby," she said, holding the envelope like it was something fragile. "Dropped her off one night with a note and enough cash to keep us going for a while. She said it was the only way to keep her safe." "Safe from what?" James snapped, his voice louder than he meant it to be. "From you finding out," she said simply, "and from whoever else might have been looking." He stared at her, the words sinking in like stones. "Finding out what? That she had a kid? Why wouldn't she tell me? I loved her. We could have figured it out together." Mrs. Margaret's eyes softened, but there was a firmness there too. "It wasn't that simple, Mr. Harrington. Olivia came here every month or so, sometimes more, sometimes less. She'd bring clothes, toys, whatever Sophie needed. She'd sit with her, hold her, tell her she was sorry she couldn't stay, but she made me promise never to reach out to you. She said it'd break everything. Break what? His voice cracked, anger and hurt tangling together. What was she hiding? She handed him the envelope. This was hers. She left it for emergencies. Said I'd know when to give it to you. I reckon now's the time. James took it, his fingers brushing the worn paper. Olivia's handwriting stared back at him, his name scrawled across the front in that familiar looping script. His hands shook as he tore it open, pulling out a single sheet folded tight. The words blurred for a second before he forced himself to focus. James, it began, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found her. I'm so sorry, Sophie's mine. Not in the way you might think, but she's mine to protect. I couldn't tell you because I was afraid you'd hate me for the mess I came from. She's not safe if the truth gets out, not from you, but from him. Keep her close if you can. I love you more than you'll ever know. The letter slipped from his hands, fluttering to the floor. From him, he said, looking up at Mrs. Margaret. Who's she talking about? The older woman hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. She never gave me a name, she said. Just said Sophie's father was someone powerful, someone she ran from before she met you. She thought he'd forgotten, but she was terrified he'd come looking one day. James's mind raced, a dozen questions slamming into each other. Olivia was someone else? Before him? It wasn't jealousy that hit him. It was the betrayal of not knowing, of being left in the dark while she carried this alone. He bent down, picked up the letter, and read it again, her words cutting deeper each time. What happened to her? He asked, his voice hoarse, after she stopped coming. Mrs. Margaret's face softened with sadness. She died, didn't she? The accident. Sophie didn't understand at first, kept asking when she'd come back. I had to tell her the truth eventually. Broke my heart to see that little girl cry herself to sleep. James looked toward the stairs, where Sophie had disappeared. A kid who'd lost her mom, twice, in a way. He didn't know what to believe anymore, but one thing stuck with him. Olivia had loved this girl, enough to build a secret life around her. And now here he was, standing in the middle of it, with no idea what came next. I need to know more, he said finally, folding the letter and slipping it into his pocket. Everything you've got. Mrs. Margaret nodded. I'll tell you what I can, but you ought to talk to Sophie too. She's got her own pieces of this puzzle. Ones even I don't have. James exhaled, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. Whatever Olivia had been running from, it was catching up now, and he wasn't about to let it take Sophie down with it. James sat on the worn couch in Hope House, the letter from Olivia burning a hole in his pocket. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as Mrs. Margaret's words echoed in his head. A powerful man, someone Olivia had run from. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. His wife, the woman who'd stood by him through late nights and brutal deals, hiding a secret this big. And Sophie, this quiet little girl with Olivia's eyes, was at the center of it all. He needed answers, real ones, not just scraps of a story pieced together from a faded letter. Mrs. Margaret had gone to make tea, leaving him alone with his thoughts for a moment. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in a while. Daniel Pierce, a private investigator he'd hired a few times for business messes. Daniel was sharp, discreet, and didn't ask too many questions. The line clicked after 2 rings. James, Daniel's gruff voice came through. Been a while. What's up? I need you to dig into something, James said, keeping his voice low. Personal this time. My wife, Olivia. She might have had a kid before we met, a girl named Sophie Miller. She's been at a place called Hope House in Chicago. I need everything you can find. Her birth records, Olivia's history, anything tying them together. And if there's a father out there, I want his name. Daniel let out a low whistle. Heavy stuff. You sure you want to open that box? Just do it, James said, sharper than he meant to. Fast. All right, boss, give me a couple days. I'll call you when I've got something. James hung up just as Mrs. Margaret came back with 2 chipped mugs of tea. She set one in front of him and sat across the coffee table, her hands clasped tight. "Sophie's upstairs," she said. "She's a good kid, tougher than she looks, but she's been asking about Olivia a lot lately. I think she knew you'd show up eventually." He took the mug, the heat seeping into his palms, but didn't drink. "What else did Olivia tell you about this, father?" "Not much," she admitted. "Just that he was trouble. Said he'd moved on, built a life somewhere else, but she never stopped looking over her shoulder. I figured he was some big shot, someone with money or power. She'd get this look in her eyes when she talked about him, like she was scared he'd find her again." James's jaw tightened. He knew plenty of men like that, ruthless, connected, the kind who'd bury a past like it never happened. But Olivia? She'd been soft-spoken, steady, the calm to his storm. The idea of her tangled up with someone dangerous didn't fit, until he thought about how guarded she'd been sometimes, how she'd dodged questions about her life before they met. He'd chalked it up to shyness, but now it felt like a neon sign he'd ignored. Footsteps creaked on the stairs, and Sophie appeared, clutching a tattered book to her chest. She hesitated, then sat next to Mrs. Margaret, her eyes flicking to James. "Are you mad at her?" she asked, her voice small. "At who?" James said, though he knew the answer. "Mom, for not telling you about me." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't know what I feel yet, Sophie. Mad, maybe? Confused, definitely. But I'm not mad at you. None of this is your fault." She nodded, her fingers tracing the book's spine. "She said you were busy a lot. That's why she didn't bring me home. She didn't want to mess things up for you." James' chest ached. Busy. That was an understatement. He'd spent years chasing deals, building his empire, while Olivia held down the fort. He'd thought they were a team, but now he wondered how much she'd carried alone. "Did she ever say anything about your dad?" he asked. Sophie shook her head. "Not really, just that he wasn't around and that was okay. She said she'd keep me safe no matter what." Safe. There was that word again, digging into him like a splinter. He didn't push her further. She didn't have the answers he needed. But Daniel would. 2 days later, his phone buzzed while he was staring out the window of his penthouse, the Chicago skyline glittering in the dark. He answered on the first ring. "Got something," Daniel said, his tone clipped. "Sophie Miller, born 10 years ago. No father listed on the birth certificate, but Olivia's name's there as the legal guardian, not the mother. Took some digging, but I found a sealed file from a hospital in Milwaukee. Sophie's biological mom was Emily Carter, Olivia's younger sister." James's breath caught. "Emily? Olivia's sister?" "Yeah, died of an overdose when Sophie was 2. Olivia took her in after that, got custody quietly. Looks like Emily was mixed up with some bad people, drug scene, petty crime, and here's where it gets messy. Sophie's father? Best guess from what I could pull, Victor Langston." The name hit James like a freight train. Victor Langston. A shark in a suit, a lawyer who'd made a fortune defending corporate giants and crushing anyone who got in his way. They'd crossed paths years ago when James's firm sued one of Victor's clients. It got ugly. Threats, late-night calls, a lawsuit that nearly tanked his company. Victor didn't just win, he destroyed. James had hated him ever since. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice tight. 90%, Daniel said. "No DNA proof yet. Olivia never pushed for a paternity test, but Emily and Victor were linked back then, before she spiraled. Timeline fits. And get this, he doesn't know about Sophie. Olivia made damn sure of that." James sank into a chair, the pieces snapping together with a sickening clarity. Emily, Olivia's little sister, the one she'd barely talked about. He remembered Olivia mentioning her once, years ago, her voice breaking as she said Emily had lost her way. He'd assumed she was dead or estranged, not that she'd left a daughter behind. And Olivia had taken Sophie in, raised her in secret, all to keep her away from Victor Langston. "Why didn't she tell me?" he muttered, more to himself than Daniel. "Guessing she didn't want you in Langston's crosshairs," Daniel said. "Guy's a bulldozer. Doesn't care who he flattens. If he'd known about Sophie, he might have used her to get to Emily. Or Olivia. Maybe both. James's hands curled into fists. Olivia hadn't just hidden a kid. She'd hidden a war. And now that war was his to fight. "Keep digging," he told Daniel. "I need everything. Where Victor is now, what he's up to, and don't let him catch wind of this." "On it," Daniel said, and the line went dead. James stared at the phone, his mind racing. Sophie wasn't Olivia's daughter. Not by blood. She was Emily's, a niece Olivia had claimed as her own. But those eyes, that quiet strength. They were Olivia's in every way that mattered. And Victor Langston, that bastard, had no idea what he'd left behind. James didn't know if that made things better or worse. But one thing was clear. If Victor ever found out, he'd come for Sophie, and James wasn't about to let that happen. He stood, grabbing his coat. He needed to see Sophie again, to figure out what she knew and what she didn't. Because whatever Olivia had been running from, it wasn't buried with her anymore. It was standing right in front of him, and he'd be damned if he let it slip away. James couldn't sit still after Daniel's call. The penthouse felt too big, too empty, the Chicago skyline mocking him with its cold, glittering indifference. Victor Langston. Of all the names in the world, it had to be him, the man who'd once tried to bury James's company under a mountain of legal threats, all with that smug grin plastered across his face. Back then, it had been business, a game of power James could handle. But this? This was Sophie. This was Olivia's secret, her sacrifice, and now it was his fight. He grabbed his keys and drove back to Hope House the next morning, the city waking up around him in a blur of horns and gray slush. Mrs. Margaret answered the door, her face tightening when she saw him. "You're back quick," she said, stepping aside. "Something wrong?" "Everything's wrong," he muttered, brushing past her into the cramped living room. Sophie was there, curled up on the couch with that same tattered book, her eyes flicking up to meet his. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either, just watched him like she was waiting for something to break. "Sophie," he said, softening his tone, "I need to talk to you about your mom, Olivia, and your real mom, Emily." Her fingers stilled on the book, her small frame tensing. "Emily?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Margaret said she was my mom before Olivia took me." James nodded, glancing at Mrs. Margaret, who hovered near the doorway. "Yeah, Emily was Olivia's sister. She couldn't take care of you, so Olivia stepped in." "Did she ever tell you anything about your dad?" Sophie shook her head, her brow furrowing. "No, just that he wasn't around. She said it didn't matter, as long as I was safe." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face. "Why? Do you know who he is?" He hesitated, the weight of Victor's name sitting heavy on his tongue. "I think so," he said finally. "And if I'm right, he's not someone you'd want to meet. But I need to make sure he doesn't find you first." She didn't say anything, just hugged the book tighter like it could shield her from whatever was coming. James turned to Mrs. Margaret. "Keep her close," he said. "No more bus trips to the cemetery, not until I figure this out." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'll do my best, but she's stubborn. Gets it from Olivia." James almost smiled at that, but the knot in his stomach wouldn't let him. He left Hope House with a promise to check in, his mind already racing ahead. Daniel was good, but Victor was better. Ruthless, connected, the kind of man who sniffed out secrets like blood in the water. If he didn't know about Sophie yet, it was only a matter of time. That afternoon, James was in his office, buried in paperwork he couldn't focus on, when his assistant buzzed the intercom. "Mr. Harrington, there's someone here to see you, says it's urgent." "Who?" he snapped, already dreading the answer. "Victor Langston?" The name hit him like a slap. He stood, smoothing his tie, forcing his face into the calm mask he wore for every high-stakes meeting. "Send him in." The door swung open, and there he was. Victor Langston, all sharp edges and calculated charm. 50-something, with slicked-back hair and a suit that probably cost more than most people's rent. He strode in like he owned the place. His gray eyes locked onto James, cold and unreadable. "James," Victor said, his voice smooth as polished steel. "Been a while." "Not long enough," James shot back, staying behind his desk. "What do you want?" Victor smirked, settling into a chair without being asked. "I'll cut to it. I know about the girl, Sophie Miller, my daughter." James's blood ran cold, but he kept his face stone still. "You're jumping to conclusions. She's got no father on record." "Don't play dumb," Victor said, leaning forward. "I had my people dig into Emily Carter's past after a tip came my way. Took some work. Olivia buried it deep, but the dates line up. She's mine, and I want her." James's hands clenched under the desk, nails digging into his palms. "She's not a damn asset you can claim, Victor. She's a kid Olivia raised, not you. You didn't even know she existed until what, yesterday?" Victor's smirk faded, replaced by something harder. "Doesn't change the facts. Blood's blood. I've got rights, and I'll take them. Through the courts, if I have to. You think you can keep her from me?" "She doesn't want you," James said, his voice low and steady. "She's scared of you, and she doesn't even know you yet. What kind of father shows up after 10 years and starts throwing around threats?" Victor stood, towering over the desk. "The kind who doesn't let some finance hotshot steal what's his. I don't care what Olivia told you. She's not here to argue anymore. Sophie's coming with me one way or another." The room crackled with tension, years of bad blood boiling over. James stepped out from behind the desk, closing the distance until they were face to face. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, "and I don't lose." Victor held his gaze for a long moment, then chuckled. A dry, hollow sound. "We'll see about that. I'll be in touch." He turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar and the air thick with his threat. James stood there, breathing hard, his mind racing. Victor didn't bluff. He'd lawyer up, dig up every scrap of proof, and drag this into a courtroom if he had to. And Sophie? She'd be caught in the middle. That evening, James went back to Hope House, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel the whole way. Sophie was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Margaret peel potatoes when he walked in. She looked up, her hands stilling, and he could see the question in her eyes before she even asked it. "He found me, didn't he?" she said, her voice trembling just a little. James nodded, crouching down to her level. "Yeah. His name's Victor Langston. He's your dad. Biologically, at least. He wants to take you away." Her face paled, and she dropped the potato, her hands shaking. "I don't want to go with him. He wasn't there, not like Mom was, not like you are." The words hit him harder than he expected, cracking something open inside him. He put a hand on her shoulder, steady and firm. "You're not going anywhere you don't want to. I promised Olivia I'd keep you safe, and I'm not breaking that promise." She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, and he froze for a second before hugging her back. She was small, fragile, but there was a strength in her that reminded him so much of Olivia it hurt. Mrs. Margaret watched from the counter, her eyes glistening, but she didn't say a word. Later, as Sophie went upstairs, James pulled out his phone and called Daniel again. "Victor knows," he said the second the line connected. "He's coming for her. I need ammunition. Anything to stop him. Dirt, legal loopholes, whatever you can find." "On it," Daniel said. "But Langston's a bulldog, James. You sure you're ready for this?" James looked toward the stairs, picturing Sophie's scared face, Olivia's letter still heavy in his pocket. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." He hung up, the fight settling into his bones. Victor could bring his lawyers, his money, his threats. James didn't care. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about Sophie, and he'd burn his empire to the ground before he let that bastard take her away. The next few weeks were a blur of late nights and tense phone calls. James threw everything he had into keeping Sophie out of Victor's grasp. Money, lawyers, every favor he could call in from years of climbing the finance ladder. Daniel came through with dirt on Victor. Shady deals, a buried assault charge from decades ago. Nothing concrete enough to ruin him, but enough to muddy the waters in court. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't clean, but James didn't care. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. This was family. He moved Sophie into his penthouse, turning a spare office into a bedroom with a bed, a desk, and a stack of books she'd picked out herself. She didn't say much about it, just nodded when he asked if she liked it, but he caught her running her fingers along the shelves like she couldn't believe it was hers. The place didn't feel so hollow anymore with her there. Her quiet footsteps, the rustle of pages, the way she'd hum to herself when she thought he wasn't listening. It was strange how fast she'd carved out a space in his life. Victor didn't back down easy. He dragged them into a courtroom, all polished suits and icy confidence, arguing blood rights like Sophie was some prize to be won. James sat through it, his jaw clenched, watching Sophie shrink into her chair beside him. She didn't look at Victor, not once, just kept her eyes on the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. When the judge asked if she wanted to speak, she stood up, small but steady, and said, "I don't know him. He wasn't there when I needed a dad. James was." That hit the room like a thunderclap. Victor's face darkened, but he didn't argue. Couldn't, not with the judge's eyes boring into him. James felt something swell in his chest, pride or relief, or maybe both. And when he caught Sophie's glance, he gave her a nod. She'd fought her own battle right there, and she'd won. The ruling came down a week later. Custody to James, legal guardianship sealed with Olivia's old documents and Sophie's testimony. Victor stormed out of the courthouse, his parting shot a hissed, "This isn't over, Harrington." But James didn't flinch. He'd faced worse threats and walked away. This time, he had something worth fighting for. Back at the penthouse that night, the city lights sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a glow over the living room. Sophie sat on the couch, a framed photo of Olivia in her hands, one James had kept on his desk for years, her smile soft and bright. He'd found it in a drawer and given it to her, figuring she deserved it more than he did now. "She'd be happy, you know," Sophie said, her voice cutting through the quiet, "that we're together." James sat beside her, the leather creaking under his weight. "Yeah," he said, his throat tight. "I think so too." She traced the edge of the frame with her finger, her brow furrowing like she was working up to something. "Do you hate her? For not telling you?" He'd asked himself that 100 times since the cemetery. Anger had burned hot at first, a sharp sting of betrayal. But now, looking at Sophie, at the life Olivia had tried to protect, it didn't feel so simple. "No," he said finally, "I don't hate her. She did what she thought was right. I just wish she'd trusted me with it." Sophie nodded like that made sense to her and leaned her head against his arm. It was a small thing, but it knocked the wind out of him. Trust, unguarded and real. He rested his hand on her shoulder, the weight of it grounding him. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, shattering the moment. James picked it up, his gut twisting when he saw the unknown number. He answered, keeping his voice low. "Who's this?" A pause, then a voice, cold, familiar, dripping with venom. "Enjoy your little victory, Harrington. It won't last." Victor. James's grip tightened on the phone, but he kept his tone even. "Stay away from her," he said. "You lost." The line went dead. He set the phone down, his pulse thudding in his ears, but when he looked at Sophie, she was still holding the photo, her eyes on Olivia's face. She hadn't heard, or if she had, she didn't let it show. He decided then he'd keep her safe, no matter what Victor threw at him next. "Ready for bed?" he asked, forcing a lightness into his voice. She nodded, setting the photo on the table, and stood. "Good night, James." "Good night, kid," he said, watching her head down the hall. The penthouse settled into silence again, but it wasn't empty anymore. For the first time in 3 years, it felt like home.